The sun of a cold autumn afternoon illuminated the streets of Chicago when everything began. It was an ordinary day for Jamal Carter, an 8-year-old boy who still saw the world with the innocence of someone who believes that justice and kindness are guaranteed. He was in front of a neighborhood bakery, kicking a bottle cap along the ground while waiting for his mother to come out of the shop. The smell of freshly baked bread mixed with the aroma of gasoline from the passing cars. It was at that very moment, in that insignificant moment of everyday life, that his life changed forever. A large man, wearing an expensive blazer and with a stern expression, bumped into him without warning. Jamal stumbled and fell to his knees on the rough sidewalk. Before he could get up or apologize, the heavy hand of Judge Leonard Grayson struck his face, accompanied by an insult that made the world around the boy shrink. The impact of the slap was not only physical, but symbolic. The noise echoed like thunder, silencing the murmurs of the street. The pain burned, but it was the man's hateful look that really scorched. Jamal was paralyzed, not fully understanding what had just happened, as passers-by looked on in horror. Someone pulled a cell phone from their pocket, instinctively pressing the record button. The video captured everything: the brutality of the slap, the cruelty in Leonard's eyes, and, most importantly, the word he hurled like a blade into the heart of the city: a racist insult. Within minutes, the file was already being shared by thousands of people on social media. In a few hours, all of Chicago knew the name Leonard Grayson. And in a few days, the whole country would be watching the fall of one of the most powerful men in the city. The recording spread like wildfire. In a matter of hours, the severe face of Leonard Grayson was plastered on cell phone screens, TVs, and digital newspapers, accompanied by outraged headlines such as "Judge slaps black child on the street" and "Leonard Grayson reveals his true face in racist act." The country, used to scandals involving powerful figures who seemed to escape punishment, watched with a mixture of shock and anger as the video spread. But that night, while millions were commenting online and organizing protests, one thing was still unknown to the public: the identity of the assaulted child's father. And when that came to light, the case ceased to be just another episode of blatant racism. It became a war. Victor Carter, Jamal's father, was no ordinary man. As chief judge of the Chicago Circuit Court, he was one of the most influential figures in the state's justice system. He was a man used to battling in the courts, a tireless advocate for reforming a system that so often criminalized his people. But at that moment, he was not a magistrate handling a case. He was a father seeing his son's swollen face and hearing, for the first time in his life, Jamal's trembling voice asking if he had done something wrong. Something inside Victor broke. Indignation surged through his body like electricity, but his mind remained cool. He knew he couldn't react in anger. The system expected exactly that. Instead, he did what Leonard Grayson least wanted. He used the law against him. The next day, he suspended Leonard from his position, promising a thorough investigation and a public trial. But Victor knew this was only the beginning. Leonard was not a man who accepted defeat. Leonard Grayson had always considered himself untouchable. For decades, he had presided over courts with the arrogance of one who knew that justice was merely a theater in which he wrote the script and decided the ending. His network of allies was vast: politicians, businessmen, police officers, and judges who owed him favors. Therefore, when he saw his suspension splashed across the news, he did not feel fear. He felt hatred, a visceral, almost animalistic hatred that made his face throb with fury. The slap on Jamal had not been a mistake, at least not in Leonard's mind. To him, the boy was an obstacle who had the misfortune of crossing his path. But now, he was a symbol that could ruin his life, and Leonard would not allow that. He looked at the phone on his desk, his gaze as cold as ice. He had allies at the highest levels and men willing to get their hands dirty for him. If Victor Carter thought he could humiliate him and get away with it, he would soon find out the hard way that he was mistaken. That same night, the attacks began. First came the rumors. Anonymous posts began circulating on social media, accusing Victor of corruption, embezzling funds and manipulating sentences. Tabloid newspapers published reports based on dubious sources, insinuating that he used his position to favor criminals. In a matter of hours, his reputation began to be eroded by insinuations and lies. But that was only the first blow. The second was much more direct and much crueler. In the early hours of the morning, the Carter home was engulfed in flames. The smell of smoke woke Kesha, Jamal's mother, who barely had time to understand what was happening before hearing the sound of shattering glass from the windows due to the heat. Victor ran out of the bedroom, grabbing Jamal in his arms, while Kesha snatched a blanket to cover their faces. The fire advanced quickly, consuming the walls, the furniture, the years of memories built there. They managed to escape through the back door, heading out to the street with labored breathing. But as they watched helplessly their home reduced to ashes, Victor understood one brutal truth. This was not merely a warning, it was a declaration of war. The smoke still lingered in the air when police vehicles arrived, too late to do anything but observe the smoldering remains of the Carter house. A tired white policeman with a swollen face approached Victor, a notepad in hand. "Was it an accident, Mr. Carter?" he asked, with a forced look of concern. Victor felt his blood boil. He looked around, seeing neighbors awake in the early morning, eyes wide with shock, some holding cell phones to record the moment. "Do you really think it was an accident?" Victor replied, his voice as sharp as a razor. The policeman sighed and scribbled something on his pad. "We can't assume anything until the forensics confirm it." But Victor knew the truth. He knew that this was retaliation. He knew that if the police were on the right side, those responsible would already be behind bars. Yet Leonard Grayson was not finished. The next day, even before Victor could react to the attack, another blow came. Security cameras from a dark Chicago alley recorded grainy images of a boy, about Jamal's height, spray painting hateful words on a wall aimed at the police. In minutes, the recording began to circulate, accompanied by alarming headlines. "Judge's son involved in racial vandalism, and the boy the nation defended may not be as innocent as he seems." The police did not waste any time. An official car stopped at the makeshift home where the Carters were staying, and two agents got out, cold and formal. "We received a report, Mr. Carter. We need to take Jamal in for questioning." Kesha clutched her son tightly, as if she could protect him with her body. "He's only 8 years old," she shouted, but the agents did not hesitate. Victor clenched his fists, containing the urge to explode. He knew that fighting there in front of the cameras would be exactly what Leonard wanted. He took a deep breath and said, "Then I'll go with him." The journey to the police station was suffused with suffocating silence. Jamal, huddled in the back seat between the two officers, looked at his father with frightened eyes, seeking some certainty that this wasn't as bad as it seemed. Victor tried to offer a reassuring smile, but he knew that nothing he said could erase the fear his son felt. When they arrived, the receptionist shot them a curious glance before pointing to an interrogation room. Victor felt a lump in his throat. His 8-year-old was about to be treated like a criminal. Sitting on the other side of the table, a graying detective theatrically opened a folder and slid several photos of the alleged vandalism across the table. "Do you recognize these, boy?" he asked, sliding the images along. Jamal shook his head, eyes wide. "I don't even know where this is," he said, his voice trembling. Victor, arms crossed, looked at the detective and said firmly, "This is ridiculous. My son was with me all night." The detective shrugged, as if dealing with a minor case, but his expression betrayed something else. He knew it was all just a show. "If that's the case, it's fine. We just need him to stay here while we check images from other cameras." Victor felt his jaw muscles tighten. They wanted to keep Jamal away from him, to set a precedent that would involve him in something bigger. He knew those tactics all too well, and he knew that if he didn't react carefully, they could turn that false accusation into something even more serious. It was then that his phone vibrated in the pocket of his blazer. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number. "This is just the beginning. Either you back off or your son really disappears." Victor felt a chill run down his spine. The game had just gotten even dirtier. Victor took a deep breath, keeping his expression unyielding as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. He couldn't show any weakness, not here, not at this moment. He leaned slightly forward, staring at the detective. "If my son cannot leave until you verify the camera footage, then I want a lawyer present right now." The detective let out an exaggerated sigh and closed the folder with a crisp snap. "No need to dramatize, Judge Carter. It's just procedure." Victor narrowed his eyes, "Then shorten the procedure, because if you hold an 8-year-old detained without evidence, I guarantee that this procedure will turn into tomorrow's headline." The detective hesitated. They were playing dirty, but they knew they were pushing the limits of what they could do without drawing too much attention. Finally, he mumbled something unintelligible and motioned to the officers at the door. "The boy can go, but do not leave town." Victor took Jamal's hand and left without looking back, feeling the burning gazes on his back. As soon as they passed through the courthouse doors, Kesha ran up to them and pulled her son into a tight embrace. "Never lay a hand on him again," she said, her voice firm but choked with emotion. Jamal buried his face in his mother's shoulder, trying to hold back tears. Victor wrapped his arm around the two, trying to ignore the feeling that they were surrounded by invisible enemies. But he didn't have much time to recover. His phone vibrated again. Another message. "Now that you know what we can do, imagine what's coming next." Victor tasted bitterness in his mouth. Leonard Grayson wasn't bluffing. He was preparing his next move. Victor maintained his composure as he placed the phone back in his pocket. He knew what had to be done, but hesitated. Going to the police was not an option. Leonard's enemies were infiltrated everywhere. Making it public would expose Jamal even more, turning him into an even bigger target. Kesha noticed the hesitation in her husband's eyes and did not hide her frustration. "You know they won't stop, Victor. They're just getting started. If we wait, they'll destroy us piece by piece." He rubbed his face with his hands, trying to contain the weight of the decision. "If I react the wrong way, they win. They want me to look unstable, to have a reason to take me down for good." Kesha crossed her arms, her gaze as sharp as a blade. "And what do you suggest? That we sit and wait until they get what they want?" Victor raised his head, his eyes meeting hers with a newfound firmness. "No, we need to be smarter than them." Their conversation was interrupted by the shrill sound of Kesha's phone. She answered without thinking, but what she heard on the other end sent her blood cold. A distorted voice, as if processed through a modulator, whispered, "Say goodbye to your son." The phone went silent. The room fell into immediate, absolute silence. Then, without warning, Jamal screamed. The couple turned just in time to see his bedroom window shattering into 1,000 pieces. A hooded figure was pulling the boy out, and everything happened too fast to process. Kesha's heart nearly stopped. Jamal was being taken. Instinct was faster than any rational thought. Kesha lunged toward the window, grabbing Jamal's leg before the kidnapper could pull him completely out. "No!" she shouted, with a strength that seemed to come not only from her body, but from her very soul. Victor was already in motion, rushing out of the apartment, descending the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding like a war drum. In the narrow alley behind the building, 2 men dressed in black were trying to force Jamal into a van without plates. The boy struggled, kicked, bit, doing what he could, but he was too small against the kidnapper's firm grip. Victor didn't think twice. He threw himself onto the nearest one, knocking him violently to the ground. Kesha appeared soon after, holding a piece of wood she had grabbed from the ground, and striking the second kidnapper on the head with such force that he staggered backward. Jamal used the distraction to break free and run into his mother's arms. "Run, Kesha!" Victor shouted, preparing for another blow. But then a third man emerged from the van, pointing a gun directly at Victor. Time seemed to stop. Sweat trickled down his neck as his mind processed the brutal reality of the situation. Kesha clutched Jamal tightly against her chest, her eyes wide. The armed man didn't need to say anything. The cold barrel of the pistol aimed at Victor said it all. Either they stopped or they died right there. The silence was overwhelming. The gun barrel gleamed under the dim alley light, and Victor knew that any wrong move would mean his end. He slowly raised his hands, trying to control his breathing. Kesha held Jamal so tightly that her fingers turned white, her gaze shifting between her husband and the armed man. The two injured kidnappers got up, still dazed but ready to retaliate. The leader of the group, the man with the gun, finally broke the silence. "Don't move," he said in a harsh, unhurried voice, as if he had complete control over the situation. "You've already lost." Victor looked around, searching for an escape, some advantage. But all he saw were dirty walls, piles of trash bags, and a van about to drive his son away. He refused to accept it. Then an unexpected sound cut through the air. Sirens, loud, growing closer by the second. The man with the gun muttered a curse under his breath and exchanged a glance with his accomplices. "Damn! Someone called the police!" Kesha's heart raced. She didn't know who had made the call, but at that moment, it was the only thing keeping them from losing Jamal. The leader hesitated for a few seconds, then lowered his gun with a brusque gesture. "This isn't over," he said, pointing a finger at Victor as if making a promise. Then the three of them ran to the van and sped away, tires screaming on the asphalt. Victor remained still, watching the vehicle vanish into the darkness, his hands still trembling. He did not feel victorious. That was not a rescue. It was a warning. They would be back. When the police vehicles finally arrived, officers got out with guns drawn, ready to act, but it was too late. The kidnappers had already disappeared. One of the officers, a short, stocky man with a thin mustache, approached Victor with an expression that mixed skepticism and boredom. "We received a call about an attempted kidnapping. Can you tell us what happened?" Victor looked at him, still feeling his heart pounding in his chest. They knew. The police were part of it. The way the officer spoke, his relaxed posture, the lack of urgency, everything screamed complicity. Victor took a deep breath and replied, choosing his words carefully. "3 men tried to take my son, armed. They fled in a black van, no plates." The officer scribbled something on his notepad unhurriedly. "All right, we'll check the area cameras to see if we can find anything." But the tone in his voice made it clear that they wouldn't find much. Kesha could no longer contain her outrage. "They almost took our son, and you're acting as if it were just another minor incident." The officer raised his eyebrows, but maintained the same apathetic tone. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset, but we have to follow protocol." Victor grabbed Kesha's arm before she exploded. He knew that arguing there would only put them in an even worse position. "Let's go," he whispered to her. Kesha looked at him, incredulous, but realized he was right. They couldn't trust the police. There was no one to protect them, except themselves. As they left the alley, Victor took his phone out and sent a short message to the only person who could help them at that moment. "I need you. Now." He didn't know if Lila still answered his messages, but if she did, maybe there was still a chance to turn the game around. Victor drove in silence through the streets of Chicago, his fingers white from gripping the steering wheel. In the back seat, Jamal slept, exhausted by the trauma of the past few hours. Kesha, beside him, kept her eyes fixed on the road, her face set in determination. There was no more discussion between them. They both knew what this meant. Leonard Grayson wasn't just trying to destroy Victor publicly. He wanted to destroy his family physically. But as Victor contemplated the best way to react, his phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and saw a short, direct response from Lila. "Same place. 30 minutes. A wave of relief washed over his chest, but it was immediately replaced by a sense of urgency. Lila was the best hacker he knew, a specialist in unearthing buried dirt. If anyone could track Leonard and expose his game before it was too late, it was her. Victor turned off the road into an underground parking lot of an abandoned building. That was where Lila operated, away from the system's prying eyes. As soon as he parked, Kesha turned to him. "Do you trust her?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. Victor hesitated, then nodded. "She's saved my skin before. If anyone can give us an edge, it's her." Kesha sighed, looking at the sleeping child in the back seat. "Then let's do this right." They got out of the car and crossed the damp darkness of the parking lot to a hidden side door. Victor knocked 3 times, and seconds later, the lock was disengaged. The door opened just enough to reveal a pair of watchful eyes. "You're screwed, Carter," Lila said with a half smile, "but I think I can help you screw him even more." Lila's small hideout was illuminated only by the bluish light of multiple screens spread across the table. Cables snaked across the floor, connecting equipment that seemed straight out of a spy movie. The air smelled of stale coffee and overheated electronics. Victor and Kesha entered, closing the door behind them, while Lila sat at the keyboard, typing without glancing at them. "It's been a while since you looked for me, Carter. Last time it was to clean up a senator's mess. Now you need me to take down a judge," she said without taking her eyes off the screens. Victor crossed his arms. "Grayson crossed a line that not even he can erase. He tried to kidnap my son." Lila stopped typing and finally turned to him. "Really? Then he's more desperate than I thought." Kesha stepped forward, arms crossed, her impatience evident. "So can you help us or not?" Lila snorted. "Of course I can, but first I need to know exactly what you want." Victor leaned over the table, his eyes filled with determination. "I want everything. I want the records, the contacts, the transactions, anything linking Grayson to this corruption network. He isn't just a racist judge. He has dirty people working for him. I need evidence that the justice system can't ignore." Lila raised an eyebrow. "You think there's any justice that can ignore that?" Victor knew she was right. The system was designed to protect men like Leonard Grayson. But if they could make it public enough, if the pressure were overwhelming, there would be no choice. Lila snapped her fingers and turned back to the screens. "All right. Let's dig. But I warn you now, if we go too deep, there's no turning back." Lila's mechanical keyboard clacked furiously as she navigated through protected servers, breaking through layers of security as if it was second nature. Kesha watched with crossed arms, alternating her gaze between the screen and her sleeping son on an old couch in the corner of the room. "Where do we start?" Victor asked urgently. Lila smiled sideways. "With the most visible dirt. Grayson is smart, but no one in power for so long keeps their hands clean enough. The screens filled with information, bank records, encrypted emails, deleted messages. Here's what I already had on him," Lila continued, enlarging a document. "Embezzlements, connections with extremist groups, illegal deals, but there's something more interesting here." She scrolled down to a series of recent transfers. Large amounts leaving ghost accounts and going to unknown names. Dirty money. Victor narrowed his eyes. "And if we follow the trail, where does it lead?" Lila clicked a few times, activating trackers. "Depends. Some of these names belong to police officers, others to businessmen. But this one," she pointed at a name on the screen and Kesha leaned in to read. "Gregory Holt." Victor's blood ran cold. "That can't be right." Lila looked at him, intrigued. "Who is this guy?" Victor ran a hand over his face, feeling a weight settling on his shoulders. "He was one of my mentors when I entered the judiciary. One of the few judges I thought were really trying to change the system." Lila spun in her chair and crossed her legs. "Either he was playing a very long game, or you never really knew who he was." Victor felt a mixture of disbelief and boiling anger inside him. Gregory Holt had been one of the few men he respected in the system, For years, Victor had believed that Holt fought for the same changes he did, that he wanted to reform a rotten structure from the inside out. But here was proof that he was no different from Grayson, perhaps even worse. Kesha noticed the tension on her husband's face and touched his arm. "Does that change anything?" Victor closed his eyes for a moment before answering. "It changes everything. If Holt is involved, it means that this network is bigger than we imagined." He turned to Lila, his eyes fixed on hers. "Can you find out what his role is in all this?" Lila smiled and returned to her keyboard. "If he has secrets, I'll find them." Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the sound of typing and tense breaths filling the room. Then suddenly, Lila stopped. "I found something." Victor and Kesha moved closer to the screen, where a series of decrypted emails was being revealed. These messages are between Holt and Grayson. And from what I'm seeing, they're not just accomplices. Holt is the one pulling the strings. Kesha frowned. "What? You mean Grayson answers to him?" Lila nodded. "That's right. Grayson may be dirty, but Holt is the one who keeps everything running. He organizes the payments, protects the contacts, manipulates the cases." Victor clenched his fists. "That means Grayson isn't the end of the line. If we want to bring down this empire, Holt needs to fall as well." Victor felt a lump in his throat. Holt was more than a corrupt judge. He was the backbone of the entire operation. Taking him down would not only be a blow against Grayson, but against the entire structure that protected men like him. But that also meant they were dealing with an even more dangerous enemy. "If Holt is at the top, he already knows we're getting close," Victor murmured, running his hand over his forehead. "If he feels threatened, he won't hesitate to finish us off." Kesha nodded slowly, crossing her arms. "Then we have to act first, before he has a chance." Lila swiveled her chair and looked at the two. "I can leak part of this information now and turn the media against them. But without more concrete evidence, they might claim it's digital manipulation." Victor knew Lila was right. They needed something undeniable, something that even Holt couldn't erase. It was then that Jamal, who had been sleeping until that moment, stirred on the sofa and slowly opened his eyes. His voice came out low and trembling. "What's going to happen to us?" The silence in the room was immediate. Kesha moved closer and sat beside her son, stroking his hair. "We're going to protect you, my love." But Jamal didn't seem convinced. He looked up at his father, his eyes wide and full of fear. "They tried to take me. They're still going to try, aren't they?" Victor knelt beside him, holding his small hands. "We're not going to let them. I promise." Yet even as he said this, he felt the weight of doubt. They were up against an enemy with almost limitless resources, and now, more than ever, they needed allies. Victor stood up, his eyes fixed on the screen full of data that Lila had managed to pull. It wasn't enough just to have the information. They needed to figure out the best way to use it. "We need a lawyer who can put this in court before they have time to clean up the mess," he said thoughtfully. Kesha raised an eyebrow. "Do you know someone who has the guts to handle this?" Victor sighed. He knew many people in the legal circle, but few were willing to face a war like this. Then a name came to mind: Nadia Price. She was a fierce lawyer, known for her relentless stance against corruption and hate crimes. More than once, she had confronted judges and prosecutors in court, exposing their illegal practices without fear of the consequences. If anyone could bring this to justice, it was her. Without wasting any time, Victor picked up the phone and called Nadia. The phone rang a few times before she answered. "Victor Carter. It's been a while," she said, her voice filled with curiosity. "I imagine you're not calling me about the weather." Victor didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Grayson and Holt. I have proof of the connection between the two, and more than that, they tried to kidnap my son." On the other end of the line, there was a brief silence loaded with tension. "Meet me tomorrow morning. Bring everything you have." Victor nodded, feeling a thread of hope growing within him. "Thank you, Nadia." But before he could hang up, her voice came back firmly. "Don't thank me yet. If what you're saying is true, we've just entered a fight that could change everything." That night was long and restless. Victor and Kesha took turns keeping watch over the improvised apartment where they were hiding, knowing that at any moment another act of retaliation could occur. Jamal slept between them, breathing heavily as he tried to process the terror of the past few hours. Victor watched his son, feeling an overwhelming weight in his chest. He shouldn't be living through this, but fleeing was no longer an option. Either they faced Grayson and Holt head-on, or they would lose everything. The clock struck 5 in the morning when Victor finally grabbed his car keys. "I'm going to see Nadia." Kesha grabbed his arm before he left. "What if something goes wrong?" He took a deep breath, trying to mask the uncertainty he felt. "Then you take Jamal and disappear. Don't wait for me." She hated that answer. He knew it by the way her eyes narrowed, by the way her fingers dug into his arm. But Kesha didn't argue. She only nodded, her heart heavy. Victor left the apartment, each step carrying the feeling of being watched. When he reached the car, he looked around, alert for any strange movement. Nothing, but he knew that by the time he met Nadia, he would cease to be just a target. He would become a real threat to Holt and Grayson, and that meant their counterattack wouldn't be far behind. Victor drove silently through the quiet streets of Chicago, every red light feeling like a trap waiting to close in on him. He kept a close eye on the rearview mirror, looking for any sign that he was being followed. He reached the meeting point, a discreet cafe in the South Loop, and parked in a secluded spot. He went inside and spotted Nadia sitting in an isolated corner, a half-finished coffee in front of her. Her curly hair was tied up in a hasty bun, and her sharp eyes analyzed him as soon as he approached. "You look like a man who hasn't slept in days," she remarked, pushing a second cup of coffee toward him. Victor accepted it, but didn't smile. "Because that's exactly how I feel." He placed the pen drive with Lila's files on the table. "Everything is here. Dirty money, connections with supremacists, manipulation of sentences. Holt and Grayson are more entrenched in the system than we thought." Nadia took the pen drive and twirled it between her fingers. "If I mess with this, you know what's going to happen, right?" Victor nodded. "I know, but we're already in too deep. There's no turning back." Nadia sighed, then connected the pen drive to her laptop and began to examine the files. Her normally impassive face grew increasingly tense as she read the documents, watched the videos, and saw the bank transfers. "Jesus Christ," she murmured, rubbing her face. She looked at Victor. "This isn't just ordinary corruption. This involves judges, prosecutors, police officers. Do you have any idea how big this bomb is?" Victor nodded. "That's exactly why we need to blow it all up." Nadia closed her laptop and rested her elbows on the table, looking at Victor with a mixture of skepticism and admiration. "If we go to the press with this, Holt and Grayson will feel the blow, but not enough to bring them down immediately. They'll use all their connections to discredit the evidence, portraying it as a conspiracy against justice. We need something undeniable, something even they can't erase." Victor rubbed his neck, frustration growing. "And what would be undeniable?" Nadia took a deep breath before answering. "A testimony from the inside, someone who has worked with them and is willing to spill everything." Victor let out a bitter laugh. Who in their right mind would do that? Who would have the courage to betray two of the most dangerous figures in justice? The plan began to form in Victor's mind as he and Nadia left the cafe. The sun was already rising over the horizon, tinting Chicago in shades of orange, but to him the city seemed darker than ever. "Who can lead us to Reynolds?" he asked as they walked toward the car. Nadia pulled her phone from her pocket and typed quickly before replying, "A journalist. Her name is Camille Torres. She investigated the Reynolds case years ago and was the only one to claim he didn't act alone. At the time, no one wanted to listen. Now, maybe it's our chance to get her to talk." Victor nodded, but his mind was already anticipating problems. If she's been on this for so long, she might be under surveillance. Holt and Grayson must know she's still looking. Nadia opened the car door and looked at him with a half smile. "Then we'd better find her before they do." On the way to the place where Camille usually worked, Victor noticed a black car in his rear-view mirror. He tried to stay calm, but something was off. The vehicle followed every one of his turns, maintaining a calculated distance. "We've got company," he murmured. Nadia glanced in the side mirror, and it took her only a couple of seconds to understand. "Damn. Do you think it's theirs?" Victor pressed his lips together, turning onto a less busy street. "If they aren't, we'll find out the hard way." The black car turned along, accelerating. Nadia pulled a revolver from her bag and unlocked it. "If they are, I'm not asking twice." Victor took a deep breath and accelerated. The game had just changed. Due to the extraordinary length of the original text, the translation is continued below. Nadia turned the coffee cup between her fingers, thoughtful. "There's one person, someone who was once part of this scheme, but then fell from grace." She opened her laptop and searched for a name. Here, Marcus Reynolds, former prosecutor expelled for involvement in evidence tampering. He was close to Holt, but was thrown to the wolves when things went south for them. Victor frowned. "And you think he'll talk?" Nadia gave a wry smile. "Depends. If we offer him the right deal, maybe he'll see this as his only chance at redemption." Victor exhaled. "Where do we find this guy?" Nadia closed her laptop and grabbed her bag. "He's in hiding, but I know exactly who can lead us to him." Victor made a sharp turn, steering the car onto a busier avenue, trying to blend into the traffic. The black car continued following them, keeping an unsettling distance. Nadia held her gun firmly, eyes fixed in the rearview mirror. "If this is an ambush, we can't be caught in the car. We have to get out on foot," she suggested, her voice steady. Victor nodded. "There's an underground parking lot 2 blocks from here. If we can get in there, we might shake them." He accelerated, weaving between cars, and suddenly turned left, entering the parking lot before the pursuing car could react. He quickly got out, driving to the lowest level and braking sharply behind a row of parked vehicles. "Get out now," he ordered. The two jumped from the car and ran to a side exit, blending into the shadows of the parking lot. Victor pulled Nadia behind a column when he heard the sound of tires squealing. The chasing car entered the lot at high speed, its headlights sweeping the area. 2 men jumped out, one in a dark suit, the other in a leather jacket and cap. They were armed. Nadia gripped her revolver, preparing for the worst. The suited man said something into the lapel radio and began walking between the cars. Victor's heart pounded. If they were discovered there, it would be the end. He looked at Nadia, and she understood without him saying a word. They needed a quick plan, or they wouldn't leave alive. Victor scanned the surroundings, looking for any exit or distraction they could use. The parking lot was spacious, with concrete pillars scattered about and some emergency stairwell doors. The problem was that any wrong move would give them away. The footsteps of the armed men echoed in the muffled silence of the basement. "We have to split their attention," Victor whispered to Nadia. She nodded, already understanding the plan. He discreetly pointed to a car parked a few meters ahead. Nadia slid to the side and with a quick movement threw a rock at the car's window. The alarm blared immediately, filling the space with a piercing sound. The 2 armed men turned toward the noise, guns in hand. It was their chance to escape. Victor pulled Nadia and ran in the opposite direction, keeping low behind the cars. They reached an exit door and Victor pushed it hard, but it was locked. "Damn," he hissed. The footsteps of the armed men grew nearer. Nadia looked at a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall and grabbed it without hesitation. "Move back," she said. With a precise blow, she broke the door's lock, and the 2 rushed into the emergency stairwell. Before closing the door behind them, they heard one of the men shout, "They're here! Shut all the exits!" Victor and Nadia had no time to lose. They climbed the stairs as fast as they could, knowing that every second could mean the difference between escaping or being caught. Victor and Nadia ascended the stairs 2 at a time, feeling exhaustion burning their legs, but they couldn't stop. Behind them, the armed men had already noticed their escape and were beginning to climb too. "They're going to catch us," Nadia panted. Victor looked up and saw a door that led to the ground floor. If we can get out onto the street, maybe we can blend in. He shoved the door with his shoulder and was met by the daylight and the sound of cars and horns. They found themselves in an alley between two buildings, surrounded by dumpsters and boxes. Victor grabbed Nadia's arm. "We have to act like we just didn't escape an ambush." They stepped out onto the sidewalk, blending with the pedestrians. Victor discreetly looked back and saw the men leaving the building, eyes scanning the crowd. One of them took out his phone and started speaking hurriedly, likely alerting other teams. "They're calling for reinforcements," Nadia murmured. Victor swallowed hard. "We need to find Camille before they do that for us." Nadia nodded and grabbed her phone to call the journalist. "I hope she's still alive to answer." Victor shivered. They were up against enemies who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate threats. If Camille knew too much, she might already be on Holt and Grayson's hit list. The phone rang 3 times before a hesitant voice answered. "Who is it?" Camille Torres asked, tension evident in her tone. Nadia was direct. "My name is Nadia Price. I'm with Victor Carter. We need to speak with you now." There was a pause on the other end. "If you're calling me, it means you've dug too deep into the wrong hole." Victor picked up the phone. "Camille, Holt and Grayson have sent people after us. They know we're trying to expose them." A silence ensued for a few seconds before she replied, "I warned you. These guys don't play around. But if you've made it this far, there's no turning back." Victor looked at Nadia, both of them knowing they were about to plunge even deeper into the war. "Where can we meet you?" Camille hesitated before saying, "There's an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district near the river. I hide there when things heat up, but don't leave a trace." The call ended. Victor put his phone away and exhaled deeply. If she's hiding, it means Holt is after her too. Nadia looked around, ensuring they weren't still being followed. "Then we have to get to her before they do." The two took a taxi, trying to avoid using their own vehicles. The driver didn't even look at them. He simply drove in the indicated direction. Time seemed to drag. Victor watched the city pass by the window, aware that every minute was precious. When they finally arrived at the industrial district, they quickly got out and walked down an alley between warehouses, finding a rusted door slightly ajar. "Welcome to the underworld of truth," Nadia murmured before entering. Inside, the warehouse was a chaotic jumble of scattered papers, stacked boxes and monitors flickering with open files. At the back of the space, a dark-haired woman tied in a ponytail watched them warily, holding a small revolver in her hand. "Close the door," Camille ordered, without taking her eyes off them. Victor raised his hands, signaling they weren't there to cause trouble. "We just want to talk." Camille slowly lowered her weapon, but remained guarded. "I've seen you on the news. The slap on your son was just the beginning. Grayson and Holt never leave anything half done." She pointed to a stack of documents on her table. "I was investigating Grayson when I found out about Holt. That's when everything fell apart. I got fired, my files were erased, and a few weeks later they tried to run me over." Nadia picked up one of the papers from the table and examined the scribbled notes. "Do you have anything concrete against them?" Camille crossed her arms. "I have connections, testimonies from people who disappeared shortly after talking to me, but nothing that can really tie them down." Victor took a deep breath. "And if we can give you proof? Bank records, encrypted conversations, even videos of transactions." Camille narrowed her eyes. "If it's true, you're dealing with the most dangerous thing you've ever touched. But if we expose everything at once, maybe they won't be able to cover up the truth in time." She turned to an old cabinet and pulled out a thick envelope. "I have a name for you. Someone who once worked directly with Holt. If he talks, everything falls apart." Victor took the envelope and opened it, a shiver running down his spine as he read the name. Marcus Reynolds. Victor stared at the name on the paper for several seconds, feeling an even heavier weight on his shoulders. "Reynolds again," he murmured. Nadia crossed her arms. "We already knew he was key, but if Camille has reached him too, it means he knows more than we imagined." Camille nodded. grabbing a crumpled cigarette from the table and lighting it with trembling hands. Marcus was Holt's trusted man. He tampered with evidence, bought witnesses, erased traces. When he fell from grace, he thought he'd be protected, but Holt cast him aside to rot. Since then, he's been on the run, hiding in cheap motels, trying not to get killed. Victor ran a hand over his face. And where do we find him? Camille tossed a scribbled piece of paper toward him. Last known location, a motel outside the city on a secondary road. But if Holt is still interested in him, maybe they've already gotten there first. Nadia picked up the paper and looked at Victor. We have no choice. We need to find him before they eliminate him. Victor nodded, adrenaline already surging. Camille took one last drag from her cigarette and stubbed it out on the metal table. If you go there, don't linger too long. If Holt finds out Reynolds is ready to talk, he'll send someone to silence him. Victor tucked the paper in his pocket and prepared to leave, but before he did, he looked at Camille. And you? Are you safe here? She let out a dry laugh. Safety is a relative concept when you're dealing with these people, but I manage. Victor nodded, and without wasting any more time, he left with Nadia. The clock was ticking. If Marcus Reynolds was still alive, he wouldn't be for much longer. Victor and Nadia got into the car and left the industrial district, keeping a fast pace but trying not to attract attention. The road to the motel where Marcus Reynolds was supposedly located was just over an hour away. If he's still there, we have to be quick, Nadia said, checking the gun at her waist. Victor kept his eyes on the road, his thoughts racing. If Reynolds had concrete evidence, this could be the final blow against Holt and Grayson. But if they had already reached him, he pushed the worst possibility out of his mind and stepped on the accelerator. When they finally arrived at the motel, the place was exactly what Victor had expected. Decrepit, with a flickering neon sign and an almost empty parking lot, except for a couple of old cars. This screams ambush, Nadia murmured, looking around carefully. Victor nodded. Let's make this quick. They got out of the car and walked to the reception, where a disinterested, overweight man was watching TV behind the counter. Is Marcus Reynolds here? Victor asked. The attendant looked at him, bored. Room 12. But if you're here to collect debts, he already said he's broke. Victor ignored the comment and proceeded along the motel's external corridor, his stomach churning with each step. When they reached the door of room 12, he knocked twice. Silence. Nadia placed her hand on her gun. Victor knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Then without hesitation, he turned the knob and opened the door. The smell of blood hit them like a punch to the chest. Victor stepped in first, his breath catching in his throat. The room was dark, the light flickering weakly on the ceiling, casting irregular shadows on the walls. The metallic scent of blood was overwhelming. In the center of the room, Marcus Reynolds lay sprawled on the bed, a bullet wound in his chest and another in his forehead. Blood trickled over the stained sheet, forming a thick pool on the floor. Nadia cursed quietly, drawing her gun and quickly checking the area. Damn! We're too late. Victor approached the body, swallowing hard. Reynolds' face was pale, his eyes open in a final frozen look of terror. But something was off. He was still holding something in his right hand, as if he had tried to hide something in his last moments. Victor took a handkerchief from his pocket and carefully pried open the stiff fingers of the corpse. In the bloodied hand was a small silver pen drive. Victor's heart raced. He knew they'd kill him, he murmured. Nadia leaned in to look, and he tried to make sure he left something behind. Victor tucked the device into his pocket, feeling the symbolic weight of it. But before they could process the discovery, a sound made them freeze, tires screeching outside. Nadia ran to the window and peered out. There are people coming, 2 black cars. Victor's body tensed. They came to finish the job. Without wasting time, the two prepared to flee. This time, there was nowhere to run. Victor quickly scanned the room for an alternative exit. The room was small, with not many options. The only exit besides the front door was a narrow window in the bathroom. "We need to get out now," he said, moving to the window and trying to open it. But it was stuck. Nadia was already preparing her weapon. "If we try to exit here, they'll catch us in the hall. But if we stay, we become easy targets." Victor pulled hard on the window until it finally budged with a loud creak. Outside, there was a small area at the back of the motel, enclosed by a low wooden fence. "Let's go." He helped Nadia get out first, then squeezed himself out. As soon as their feet touched the ground, they heard the door being forced open from inside the room. Gunshots echoed inside the now empty room. "They're not here!" a male voice shouted. Victor and Nadia ran, crouched behind the fence, trying not to make any noise. Hearing footsteps inside the room, they knew they didn't have much time. Victor threw himself against the fence, knocking down part of the rotted wood, and the two squeezed through to the alley. Nadia glanced to the other side of the alley and saw an exit, a metal staircase leading to the roof of the adjacent building. "This way!" Victor grabbed Lila and started climbing, with Nadia close behind. Charlie hesitated but had no choice. Gunshots continued to ring out as they climbed, each step feeling like an eternity. As soon as they reached the roof, Victor looked down. More men were surrounding the street. There was no turning back. They needed a new plan, and fast. The cold wind atop the building whipped at the faces of Victor, Nadia, Lila, and Charlie. The sound of gunfire still echoed in the alley below as Holt's men spread out, encircling the area. Victor looked around, searching for an escape. The neighboring building was a bit lower, separated by a narrow gap. "We have to jump," he said, assessing the distance. Charlie's eyes widened. "Are you crazy?" Nadia was already gauging the possibility. "It's risky, but if we stay here, they'll climb up and kill us." With no time to debate, Victor ran to the edge, took a deep breath, and jumped. He felt his body float for an interminable second before rolling onto the concrete of the neighboring rooftop. "We made it!" he shouted. Nadia was next, running and leaping with ease. Lila hesitated, then took a deep breath and jumped, landing with a dull thud. Charlie looked down into the alley and swallowed hard. "Damn, damn, damn!" He ran and jumped, but slipped at the last moment. Victor lunged and grabbed his arm before he could fall. "Hold on tight!" Charlie kicked at the air, his eyes wide with panic. "Pull me up! Pull me up!" Victor used every bit of strength to haul him back up. Charlie rolled onto the roof, sweaty and panting. "I'm never doing that again." Lila helped him up, but before they could celebrate their escape, shots rang out from a building in the distance. "Sniper!" Nadia shouted, pushing everyone behind a large, rusted water tank. The sound of bullets caused chunks of concrete to fly through the air. Victor looked at Lila. "Can you track where they're shooting from?" She quickly grabbed her cell phone and used its camera to capture the direction of the gunfire. "There, second building to the left, middle window." Nadia adjusted her aim and fired back, forcing the shooter to duck. "We need to keep running," Victor called out. He looked toward the other end of the roof. There was another fire escape leading to a less busy alley. "This way!" They ran low, dodging bullets until they reached the fire escape. Nadia descended first, followed by Lila and Charlie. When Victor stepped onto the first stair, he heard an explosion. The impact was so strong that it sent all of them sprawling to the ground. The explosion had come from the building they'd just fled from. "They're destroying the evidence!" Lila shouted. Dust rose, mixed with the smell of gunpowder and smoke. Victor helped Charlie to his feet and looked out onto the street. "We have to get a car and leave here." Nadia checked her cell phone. "The news is exploding. The broadcast is still on, and now everyone is talking about Holt and Grayson." Victor felt a flicker of hope. They were close to the end, but they still needed to survive long enough to see their enemies fall. The group ran down the alley, their footsteps echoing on the cracked concrete as they tried to distance themselves from the explosion. The smoke began to spread through the city, and the smell of burning clung to their clothes. "This isn't just to destroy evidence," Lila murmured as she looked back. "They want to send a message." Victor knew she was right. Holt was showing everyone that he still had power, that he could still eliminate anyone who dared to challenge him. But they couldn't stop now. When they reached the main street, Victor looked around for a vehicle. "We need a car, fast." Nadia pointed to a black sedan parked on the other side of the avenue. "That one will do." Charlie's eyes widened. "Are we robbing a car now? We're running from murderers, not trying to get arrested." Victor didn't waste time arguing. He ran to the car and tried to open the door. It was locked. Nadia took an elbow and broke the window with precision, unlocking the door. "Don't you learn?" she said to Charlie, who just sighed and climbed into the back seat. Lila took the wheel and started the engine with ease, using her hacking know-how. "Where to?" Victor thought for a moment. "We need to regroup. Kesha and Jamal must be safe by now, but we need reinforcements before Holt tries something worse." Nadia agreed. "We have to make sure that the journalists who got the files publish the stories before they're silenced." The car sped through the city as Lila skillfully dodged traffic. On the radio, the news was already breaking. Judge Holt involved in a corruption and murder scheme. Leaked recordings exposed the biggest judicial scandal in years. Victor felt a weight in his chest. It was a breakthrough, but still not enough. Holt and Grayson were still at large. They still had power. But before they could plan a new move, Lila held her breath. Oh no. Victor looked ahead and saw what troubled her. Police blockades in both directions. The car braked sharply. Patrol cars surrounded the avenue, and armed officers began emerging, surrounding the vehicle. "Shit," Nadia murmured, holding the gun to her chest. "Is this Holt's doing?" Lila looked in the rearview mirror. If it were, they'd already be shooting. One of the officers approached, speaking into his radio. "Get out of the vehicle with your hands up." Victor looked at the others. If this was a setup by Holt, they were done for. If it was the real police, they might be able to turn the tables. He looked at Nadia. "Let's find out if we have any chance." He opened the car door and got out with his hands raised. Victor stepped out, arms raised to show he was unarmed. Nadia and Lila followed suit, both with tense expressions. The officer at the front watched them suspiciously, his gun still drawn. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a firm, accusatory tone. What should have been a simple police check felt more like a trap, and Victor could sense it in the charged air. He didn't want to risk being arrested or, worse, falling into a staged confrontation by Holt, so he decided to be direct. "We're civilians trying to survive. If you continue with this approach, you'll see that we're fleeing from a danger greater than anything you can understand." The officer stared at him, as if weighing his words, but hesitated. He gestured with his gun, ordering the other officers to step back a bit, giving space for the conversation. "Who are you saying you're fleeing from?" the officer asked, his voice still laced with distrust. "From the system," Victor replied, emphasizing the word so that it carried meaning. He felt that revealing even a hint of the truth could be dangerous. "There's someone in government trying to silence us. The leaked names are at stake and they can't hide it anymore." Nadia stepped forward. "Judge Holt, what he's doing cannot be ignored. He's the head of a network of corruption, manipulation, and even murder. And we're not the only ones in danger." Her declaration seemed to hit its mark. The officer looked around at his colleagues, and for a moment, it seemed as though the tension eased. Victor seized the pause to continue. "Do you think this is just another ordinary case? What we have is not a simple crime. We're talking about a judge who manipulated the law, and it seems even has influence over his own superiors." He looked directly into the officer's eyes, trying to convey sincerity. "Now, all we want is the right to live, and for the truth to reach the media without censorship." The officer took a deep breath, visibly conflicted. "I didn't know anything about this. Holt, he has influence, but as far as I know, he's still under investigation." "What you're saying?" The officer paused, clearly trying to process the information, but Victor saw a change in his gaze the moment he realized the gravity of what was being said. "What can I do for you?" the officer finally asked, his expression softening slightly, though with visible incredulity. A glimmer of hope touched Victor. "Let us go. And if possible, help us reach those who need to know this, the media, the journalists, Anyone who has the means to get this story out before they silence us." The officer glanced at his colleagues, who were waiting for a decision, but unsure of what to do. "I'm not in a position to make such decisions, but I can make a move that will help you get out of here." He stepped back, looked at his radio and said, "Stay here. I'll do what I can." "Agree." While he went to speak with his superiors, Victor exchanged a quick look with Nadia and Lila. They had to act fast. If the officer helped, there was still a chance to put the truth in the hands of those who could bring down Holt and Grayson. But if not, their options would be limited. The streets were increasingly full of watchful eyes, and their enemies were closer than ever. The officer returned with a somber expression, his shoulders tense as if he'd done something he shouldn't have. "You have 10 minutes. Know that I can't guarantee anything after that." He quickly glanced at the other officers, who seemed more focused on their vehicles and the traffic than on them. "If you're seen here after this, you know what will happen." Victor felt an instant relief, but knew they were still walking a tightrope. "Thank you, we'll make it quick." Nadia and Lila wasted no time. If they had 10 minutes, that was enough to reach the meeting point with the journalists, the only place where the evidence could be published without the risk of manipulation. They ran back to the car, with Lila taking the wheel once again. "Where are we going?" Charlie asked, still visibly shocked by what had happened. "To a building downtown," Victor replied, eyes fixed on the road. "If everything goes well, these recordings will be the end of Holt and Grayson." Nadia said nothing, her gaze fixed out the window, heavy with thought. She knew that what they had done so far wasn't enough. Holt and Grayson could still react, still try to destroy what remained, but that wouldn't stop the truth from getting out. Deep down, she felt that the moment for change had arrived. The car glided through the streets toward downtown, each second feeling longer than the last. When they arrived at the building, a small independent radio station known for opposing the corrupt power system dominating the city, Victor sensed a tense atmosphere. The room was filled with people, journalists and activists gathered to disseminate the information. They were ready, though none of them knew how huge the reaction from the powerful would be. "Let's go," said Victor as he stepped out of the car with the others. They crossed the building's lobby and entered the room where the journalists waited anxiously. The atmosphere was charged with expectation. As soon as they entered, the murmur of conversations and ringing phones abruptly ceased. Every eye turned toward Victor, Nadia, Lila and Charlie, who carried the pen drives and documents that could finally bring down Holt and Grayson. "Are you ready?" asked one of the journalists, a middle-aged man with glasses and a determined posture. He looked like someone accustomed to being at the center of the fight for justice, not as someone waiting for something, but as someone determined to ensure the truth was heard. Victor nodded. "Yes, we have everything you need." With a swift gesture, Lila passed the pen drives to the journalist. He sat at a table, connecting them to his laptop as the other journalists began clustering around, eager to examine the evidence. "We have time until the system starts moving against us," the journalist continued, typing while glancing at the files. "But if these files are as they claim, our biggest concern now will be ensuring they reach those who can really do something about it." Nadia stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the screen. "And what do we do after this evidence goes public?" The journalist didn't lift his eyes from the laptop, but his voice was calm and firm. "We make noise. We ensure that everyone knows. Because with the media's pressure, they can't hide it anymore." Minutes dragged by as the journalists worked, passing the information among themselves and verifying every piece of evidence. Finally, the man looked up, an expression of approval on his face. This is huge. Bigger than anything we've ever seen." He turned to the room. "Everyone, are you ready to broadcast the biggest revelation in the city's history?" The group around him nodded, the anxiety beginning to morph into action. One of the journalists started typing furiously, preparing posts on social media and drafting articles for news websites. The sound of keystrokes was the only noise breaking the tense silence that filled the room. The room was electric. tension mounting by the second. The screens were being filled with the first reports about Holt and Grayson, with details of the corruption and manipulation that had been exposed, and the journalists were racing against time, sending articles to websites and social media. The sound of notifications filled the air as the first comments began to appear, being shared and liked at a furious pace. Victor felt a tightening in his chest, a mix of relief and anxiety. The battle was being won, but the war was far from over. Holt and Grayson were not men who would be defeated without a fight. "This is going to cause chaos," Nadia murmured, watching the viewership numbers rise on the journalists' screens. "But it's the chaos that needs to happen." Victor looked at her and felt the weight of her words. They had fought against an entire system, a system so deeply entrenched in corruption and injustice that it seemed impossible to dismantle. But at the same time, he knew that this was the only chance to change something. There was no turning back now. Holt and Grayson were being exposed to the world, but the price for all of them would be high. "It's the only way to ensure that things change," Victor replied, his voice full of determination. "They can try to stop us, but the truth is already out on the streets." As the journalists continued their work, the faces of Victor, Nadia, Lila, and Charlie were broadcast on TV screens throughout the room, being streamed live to the public. The pressure was mounting. They were about to become the central figures of a revolution, but what happened next, no one knew for sure. The system was about to be dismantled, but the consequences were unpredictable. Holt and Grayson had powerful allies, and Victor knew that meant the fight was far from over. Yet at that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It was the first time he truly believed that justice could indeed prevail. The impact of the disclosure was immediate. The city of Chicago, which had until then been silent, awoke to a frenzy of protests, debates, and demonstrations. Social media was saturated with videos, news reports, and comments from people outraged by the systemic corruption that had been revealed. Journalists from every corner began investigating, and even political figures started distancing themselves from Holt and Grayson. The world watched, and Victor knew that this was the last chance to truly change something. But with the weight of truth also came the weight of responsibility. Holt and Grayson wouldn't be defeated so easily, and the war against them, in some way, was only just beginning. Nadia looked at the screens, and then at Victor. "Now is when we'll see if they're really going to fall, or if the system will protect itself." Victor felt his heart tighten. He knew that despite all the disclosure, the fight wouldn't be easy. The media might broadcast the truth, but there was still a lot of corruption and manipulation happening in the shadows. Holt had allies in every sphere of power, and the coming days would be crucial. "Now we have to stay one step ahead of them," Victor said, eyes fixed on the continuously spreading news. "We can't stop until we see justice done, and we can't count on the system to fix itself." He stood up, deciding that he would no longer be a passive spectator. It was time to continue the fight, but now with a solid base and the confidence that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. Victor's phone vibrated in his hand, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Lila, accompanied by a file. "What is this?" Nadia asked, looking curiously. Victor opened the file, and a look of shock crossed his face. "Lila got more," he said, his voice tense. It was a video recording showing Grayson and Holt in a secret meeting with a number of powerful figures, discussing their next steps after the information was leaked. "They know what's happening," Victor said. "They know they're losing." The video captured the tension in the room, the faces of those involved growing increasingly nervous. "They're planning to act fast," Nadia murmured. "They'll try to stage a coup, and we can't let that happen." "This is much bigger than we thought," Victor continued, as more details emerged in the video. "Holt and Grayson have a plan to escape, and they're coordinating with allies within the government." He looked at Nadia. "We need more evidence, something that definitively ties them to these moves so that their arrest is guaranteed." But at the same time, he knew they had little time. The images showed the two men discussing strategies and scheming their next moves to maintain control of power. The war isn't over, Victor concluded, feeling the pressure mounting. Now that the truth is out, they won't stop until they're sure no one else can challenge their position. Leonardi, with the new evidence in hand, Victor knew that time was against them. The tension in the room was palpable as he and Nadia analyzed Lila's video. Holt and Grayson's escape plan was taking shape, and that meant they needed to act now or lose the chance to finally put an end to that corruption network once and for all. Lila, do you have anything else that can help us? Victor asked, his eyes fixed on the computer screen. Lila was typing furiously. I've found a way to break into Grayson's systems, but I'll need a little more time. If I succeed, that'll give us direct access to everything he's doing right now. Nadia crossed her arms, looking out the window. We need that now. We can't let him slip away. We have to expose everything, no matter the cost. She was right. Without being able to put the right evidence in the hands of justice, everything they had done so far would be in vain. Then let's push, Victor said determinedly. Lila, do whatever it takes. Nadia and I will prepare to go to court. If we can get an emergency hearing, we can show the world what Grayson and Holt are doing to escape the consequences. Lila looked at them, a look of understanding on her face. Understood. I'll do what's necessary. Victor and Nadia left the building, their steps quick and calculated. The clock was against them, and every decision weighed more than ever. We'll have to face the system head-on, Nadia said as they walked. We can't rely on the authorities now. Holt and Grayson have roots too deep. Victor nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. We need to be smarter. We have to ensure that before any move is made, the evidence reaches a secure source, leaving no trace. They knew that if they didn't act cautiously, everything they'd done so far could be undone, and their enemies would still have the power to control the narrative. We have a chance, and we can't waste it, Victor continued. The court needs to see this clearly. We have to pressure the legal system and ensure that arrests are made before Holt and Grayson can react. They reached the car, where Lila was waiting. Here's what we need, she said, handing Victor a copy of the evidence they had gathered. I managed to hack into Grayson's records. This includes all his bank transactions, messages, and even details of his contacts with government figures. Nadia looked at the pile of documents. This will be enough to take them down, if we can present it in court. With the evidence finally in hand, the group headed to the courthouse. The anxiety was palpable, and everyone knew they were about to take a decisive step. They had played all the cards they had, but the risk of loss still lurked at every corner, in every move made by Holt and Grayson. Yet, Victor felt a renewed confidence. He knew that, for the first time in a long time, justice was on their side. They were not just fighting against powerful men, they were fighting for the truth that had been denied for so long. The courthouse was in chaos when they arrived, with journalists and protesters gathering on the steps and streets around the building. The doors were closed, but the pressure from outside was uncontrollable. They already know what we're doing, Nadia commented, watching the crowd. It's going to be a challenge to get in. Victor looked at her. We have to ensure that the evidence reaches the judge one way or another. They entered the courtroom, where the tension was even higher. The judge, aligned with the local government, already began to eye the group with suspicion. But Victor wouldn't be intimidated. They had come this far, and there was no turning back. It was time to expose the whole truth. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on Victor and his group. The judge looked at him, his expression impassive. Mr. Carter, I hope you have a good explanation for being here with such grave allegations. The judge's voice was firm, but there was something in the way he spoke that indicated he already knew what it was about. Victor did not hesitate. I have the truth in my hands, and justice cannot be ignored. He handed over the evidence to one of the officers present, who passed it directly to the judge. These documents prove Grayson's and Holt's corruption, and they are just a small part of what we know. Murmurs began to spread throughout the room, and the reactions of the audience shifted from doubt to consternation. The judge looked over the papers, his face turning pale. He knew that by accepting this evidence, the course of history could be altered forever. "These are very serious accusations," he finally said in a lower voice. "But if all of this is true, Holt and Grayson will have nowhere to hide." The judge's words brought both relief and a sign that the battle was not yet over. There was something in the air, a feeling that made Victor sense that the courtroom was finally ready to act. The judge lifted his eyes, looking first at the documents and then at Victor, Nadia, and Lila. The silence was heavy, and everyone in the courtroom waited for his decision. The minutes seemed to drag as he reviewed the evidence. Finally, he looked at the defense lawyers for Holt and Grayson, who sat silently, appearing uncomfortable. "This court is adjourned for a moment," the judge announced, and the room filled with murmurs. He left the bench, taking the documents with him, while everyone waited anxiously. Victor and his group stood, waiting, feeling the tension in the air. They did not know what the judge would do next. The system was designed to protect the powerful, and Grayson and Holt still had many allies in key positions. But suddenly, the judge returned to his seat and made a gesture that changed the course of the proceedings. "After reviewing this evidence and considering the gravity of the accusations, I am issuing immediate arrest warrants for Leonard Grayson and Gregory Holt. They will be tried for their crimes." The courtroom erupted in applause. Finally, justice had prevailed. Victor looked at Nadia and Lila, a smile of relief crossing his face. They had achieved the impossible. Grayson and Holt, until now untouchable, were now being led to court, and their network of power was beginning to crumble before the exposed truth. The courtroom was filled with cameras, journalists, and activists celebrating the victory of justice. The weight that Victor had carried for so long seemed finally lifted, yet he knew the work was far from over. Holt and Grayson were only the beginning. Many more would have to be held accountable. "This is just the beginning," Nadia said, looking at the tumult forming outside the room. "Now, we must ensure that the consequences reach everyone involved." Lila approached Victor and smiled, her face tired but with a spark of satisfaction. "I knew the truth wouldn't fail, but I didn't think it would be so fast." Victor looked at her gratefully. "Without you, none of this would have been possible." He looked once more at the journalists streaming out, already beginning to disseminate the story. Now, the whole city will know what happened. The mission was accomplished, but Victor knew that the fight for justice was only just beginning. Holt and Grayson might be behind bars, but the system that supported them still remained intact. He discussed the next steps with Nadia and Lila. "We have to ensure that reforms are implemented," Victor said, eyes focused on the future. "We can't allow what happened with Grayson and Holt to be an isolated incident." Nadia nodded, already planning how she could use her position to help accelerate reforms within the system. "Now we have the people's support. The protests and social media are on our side. If we use that, we can pressure politicians to ensure this doesn't happen again." Lila, with a tired smile on her face, added, "And if we can put the other involved parties behind bars, we can finally start changing the political dynamics of the city." They had won a battle, but the true victory would come only with permanent changes to the system. Victor knew that his fight was not only against men like Holt and Grayson, but against a system that had thrived on corruption for generations. It was time to go deeper, so that in the end, justice would truly be served. As the weeks passed, the impact of the revelations continued to resonate throughout the city. The arrest of Grayson and Holt was just the first step towards significant change, but Victor knew the work would never be easy. Each victory meant more resistance, more attacks against him and his family. But this time, he was prepared. With the support of the media, the people, and above all, the truth on his side, he believed he could continue the fight. "The hardest part was always starting," he told Nadia as they watched the city from his office window. "Now we have to ensure that the change is real." They were on the right path. The battle wasn't won yet, but finally, light was beginning to overcome the darkness. Holt and Grayson had fallen, but the system was far from fixed. Victor looked to the future with renewed determination. Justice wasn't just about winning a war, it was about ensuring that no one else would have to fight the same battles, year after year. And he, alongside his family and allies, would be there to make sure it happened. Then, Victor's phone vibrated in his hand, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Lila, accompanied by a file. "What is this?" Nadia asked, looking curiously. Victor opened the file, and a look of shock crossed his face. "Lila got more," he said, his voice tense. It was a video recording showing Grayson and Holt in a secret meeting with several powerful figures, discussing their next moves after the information was leaked. "They know what's happening," Victor said. "They know they're losing." The video captured the tension in the room, the faces of those involved growing increasingly nervous. "They're planning to act quickly," Nadia murmured. "They're going to try a coup, and we can't let that happen." "That's much bigger than we thought," Victor continued as more details emerged in the video. "Holt and Grayson have a plan to escape, and they're coordinating with allies within the government." He looked at Nadia. "We need more evidence. Something that definitively ties them to these moves so that their arrest is guaranteed." But at the same time, he knew time was running out. The images showed the two men discussing strategies and plotting their next moves to maintain control. "The war isn't over," Victor concluded, feeling the pressure increase. Now that the truth has been exposed, they won't stop until they're sure no one else can challenge their position. With the new evidence in hand, Victor knew time was against them. The tension in the room was palpable as he and Nadia analyzed Lila's video. Holt and Grayson's escape plan was coming together, meaning they had to act now or lose their chance to finally bring down this corruption network once and for all. "Lila, do you have anything else that could help us?" Victor asked, his eyes fixed on the computer screen. Lila was typing furiously. "I found a way to break into Grayson's systems, but I'll need a little more time. If I succeed, we'll have direct access to everything he's doing right now." Nadia crossed her arms and looked out the window. "We need that now. We can't let him slip away. We have to expose everything, no matter the cost." She was right. Without putting the right evidence into the hands of justice, everything they'd done so far would be for nothing. "Then let's push," Victor said firmly. "Lila, do what you need to do. Nadia and I will prepare to go to court. If we can get an emergency hearing, we can show the world what Grayson and Holt are doing to escape responsibility." Lila looked at them with understanding. "Understood. I'll do what's necessary." Victor and Nadia left the building, their steps quick and calculated. The clock was against them, and every decision felt heavier than ever. "We'll have to face the system head-on," Nadia said as they walked. "We can't rely on the authorities now. Holt and Grayson have roots too deep." Victor nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We need to be smarter. We have to make sure that before any move is made, the evidence reaches a secure source, leaving no trace." They knew that if they didn't act cautiously, everything they had done could be undone, and their enemies would still control the narrative. "We have a chance, and we can't waste it," Victor continued. "The court needs to see this clearly. We must pressure the legal system and ensure that arrests are made before Holt and Grayson can react." They reached the car, where Lila was waiting. "Here's what we need," she said, handing Victor a copy of the evidence they had compiled. "I managed to hack into Grayson's records. This includes all his bank transactions, messages, and even details of his contacts with government figures." Nadia looked at the pile of documents. "This will be enough to take them down if we can present it in court." With the evidence finally in hand, the group headed to the courthouse. The anxiety was palpable, and everyone knew they were about to take a decisive step. They had played all their cards, but the risk of losing was still there, lurking in every corner, in every move made by Holt and Grayson. Yet Victor felt renewed confidence. He knew that, for the first time in a long while, Justice was on their side. They were not just fighting against powerful men, they were fighting for the truth that had been denied for so long. The courthouse was in chaos when they arrived, with journalists and protesters gathering on the steps and around the building. The doors were closed, but the pressure from outside was uncontrollable. "They already know what we're doing," Nadia commented, observing the crowd. "It's going to be a challenge to get in." Victor looked at her. "We have to make sure the evidence reaches the judge, one way or another." They entered the courtroom, where the tension was even greater. The judge, who was in sync with the local government, already began to eye the group with suspicion. But Victor would not be intimidated. They had come this far, and now there was no turning back. It was time to expose the whole truth. The courtroom fell silent, with all eyes on Victor and his group. The judge looked at him, his expression impassive. "Mr. Carter, I hope you have a satisfactory explanation for being here with such grave allegations." The judge's voice was firm, yet something in his tone suggested he already knew what it was about. Victor did not hesitate. "I have the truth in my hands, and justice cannot be ignored." He handed the evidence over to one of the officers present, who passed it directly to the judge. "These documents prove Grayson's and Holt's corruption, and they are only a small part of what we know." Murmurs spread through the room, and the audience's reaction shifted from doubt to shock. The judge looked over the papers, his face growing pale. He knew that by accepting this evidence, the course of history could be forever altered. "These are very serious accusations," he finally said in a lower voice. "But if all of this is true, Holt and Grayson will have nowhere to hide." His words were both a relief and a sign that the battle was not yet won. There was something in the air, a sense that the courtroom was finally ready to act. The judge lifted his eyes, first looking at the documents, then at Victor, Nadia, and Lila. The silence was heavy, as everyone waited for his decision. The minutes seemed to stretch on as he reviewed the evidence. Finally, he looked at the defense lawyers for Holt and Grayson, who sat silently, looking uncomfortable. "This court is adjourned for a moment," the judge announced, and the room filled with murmurs. He left the bench, taking the documents with him, while everyone waited anxiously. Victor and his group stood frozen, the tension in the air palpable. They didn't know what the judge would do next. The system was built to protect the powerful, and Grayson and Holt still had many allies in key positions. But suddenly, the judge returned to his seat and made a gesture that changed the course of the proceedings. "After reviewing this evidence and considering the gravity of the accusations, I am issuing immediate arrest warrants for Leonard Grayson and Gregory Holt. They will be tried for their crimes." The courtroom exploded in applause. Finally, justice had prevailed. Victor looked at Nadia and Lila, a smile of relief crossing his face. They had achieved the impossible. Grayson and Holt, until now untouchable, were now being led to court, and their network of power was beginning to crumble before the exposed truth. The courtroom was filled with cameras, journalists, and activists celebrating the victory of justice. The burden that Victor had carried for so long seemed finally lifted, though he knew the work was far from over. Holt and Grayson were only the first of many who would need to be held accountable. "This is only the beginning," Nadia said, looking at the tumult forming outside. "Now, we must ensure that the consequences reach everyone involved." Lila approached Victor and smiled, her face tired yet lit by a spark of satisfaction. "I knew the truth wouldn't fail, but I didn't think it would be so fast." Victor looked at her gratefully. "Without you, none of this would have been possible." He glanced once more at the journalists streaming out, already disseminating the story. Now the whole city will know what happened. The mission was accomplished, but Victor knew the fight for justice had only just begun. Holt and Grayson might be behind bars, yet they could still react. And the fight against the system of corruption would demand more courage, persistence, and, above all, a commitment to truth. The following days were a whirlwind of media coverage, further investigations, and supportive protests. Holt and Grayson were taken into police custody, and their government connections began to unravel one by one. Yet Victor knew much still had to be done. The root of the problem lay in a system deeply entrenched in corruption, and although these two powerful men were behind bars, the structures that supported them remained intact. He spoke with Nadia and Lila, already mapping out their next steps. "We need to ensure that reforms are implemented," Victor said, eyes fixed on the future. "We can't let what happened with Grayson and Holt be an isolated incident." Nadia nodded, already planning how she could leverage her position to help accelerate reforms within the system. "Now we have the support of the people. The protests and social media are on our side. If we harness that, we can pressure politicians to ensure this doesn't happen again." Lila, with a tired smile, added, "And if we manage to put the others involved behind bars, we can finally start changing the political dynamics of the city." They had won a crucial battle, but the true victory would come with permanent changes to the system. Victor knew his fight was not just against men like Holt and Grayson, but against a system that had thrived on corruption for generations. It was time to go deeper so that in the end, justice would truly prevail. As the weeks passed, the impact of the revelations continued to resonate throughout the city. The arrest of Grayson and Holt was only the first step towards significant change, but Victor knew that the work would never be easy. Every victory meant more resistance, more attacks against him and his family. But this time he was prepared. With the support of the media, the people, and above all, the truth on his side, he believed he could continue the fight. "The hardest part was always just beginning," he told Nadia as they observed the city from his office window. "Now, we must ensure that the change is real." They were on the right track. The battle was not yet over, but finally the light was overcoming the darkness. Holt and Grayson had fallen, yet the system was far from being fixed. Victor looked to the future with renewed determination. Justice wasn't simply about winning a war, it was about ensuring that no one else would have to fight the same battles year after year. And he, alongside his family and allies, would be there to guarantee that it happened.